Welcome to Planet Vero Radio, produced at the Idea Garden Studios in Vero Beach. This is the story of liberty, with your host, John Bona.
What will you do without freedom? Will you fight? Fight against that? No! We will run, and we will live. Aye. Fight and you may die. Run, and you'll live. At least a while. And dying in your beds many years from now, would you be willing to trade all the days from this day to that for one chance, just one chance, to come back here and tell our enemies that they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom?
Good evening, and welcome to the Story of Liberty. I'm your host, John Bona, and with me are Dr. Marshall Foster and Dan Williamson. What it is, guys?
Good evening, John. It's beautiful out.
Good morning, John. Good afternoon, I'm sorry.
Yeah, you're a little bit back there. That's okay. How you doing, Marshall? I just got back from Niagara Falls in Buffalo. I was with Kirk Cameron, your buddy, and we were up there promoting our new film that you're the written storyline, Monumental, that should be released in November. It went really well, Marshall, and Kirk did a great job.
That's great. I had the same experience up in Idaho where we showed a clip and the people got excited. There's no doubt about it. With the situation we have in America, with the debt, with the problems, that people are looking for solutions, and that's what this film is going to provide, I think, fundamental solutions to our ever-increasing problems.
We're excited about it. We'll keep our listeners apprised of the progress. And, in fact, I'll be out there with you, Marshall, on Tuesday, tomorrow, actually, and we'll be meeting with the marketing team and our editing team to move Monumental forward. So I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. And, I guess we'll mention that. We'll talk about the debt, which is kind of a big item right now. Of course, it always has been. And the elite media is covering the battle over raising the debt ceiling in political terms. We hear all these political terms in our day and age. You know, who said what kind of thing, and whose plan could get the most votes, and what the polls say, what it'll mean for the next election. Those are the political terms that we hear about. Kind of putting your finger out in the wind and testing it. But, boy, this issue, as we all know, is a lot bigger than politics itself. It's really it's historic. And, raising the debt ceiling, which we all feel will happen inevitably. But without passing real reform, to put America back on a true path of fiscal responsibility, it's going to burden our children and our grandchildren with higher taxes and bigger government and less liberty for we the people. And that's what the story of liberty is all about. It's about we the people. And what we're witnessing right now, in fact, is a power struggle between 80% of the American people that feel that way, that they believe in a citizen-centered government, we the people, and the other 20% believe in a Washington big government-centered type government. But that's good news, because 8 out of 10 people want limited government, according to the last poll. And what it is, Marshall, what are you thinking these days?
Well, I think that people still have a conscience that goes back to a set of principles that founded what's called the Puritan work ethic, which was the engine of free enterprise, which drove the freest, richest nation the world's ever known. In fact, the Pilgrim Fathers created a pure free enterprise tied to republican institutions and government and religious liberty in 1620 when they came to America and got away from socialism and communism, which they were forced into by their merchant adventurers when they had to work in common, In 1623, they set up a system where everybody owned their own land, and they went out and began to plant their own crops, and everybody was accountable for themselves. And the greatest enterprise system the world has ever known began when individuals began to trust God and move forward and build their fortunes together in a free enterprise system where people had private ownership. And of course, that system is under attack today, and it has been for at least 60 or 70 years or more. And as the system is collapsing, and it's not the system of free enterprise that is collapsing, it is that we're turning away from it to a debt society. So now with the fractional reserve banking system, what's going on in Washington, D.C. is just simply the fruit of exponential destruction of our currency, which is the exponential curve. It is compound interest. People don't understand it. They didn't understand it, but now millions of Americans are waking up today to the reality that we have debted our children's children with a debt that can never be paid. And this president alone has practically doubled the national debt that it took 200 years to build, and now he has practically doubled it in 2 years, 2.5 years. So how could that be? Well, it's because of this exponential curve. It's out of control, and the only way to stop it is to go back to some fundamental principles.
You know, John, you touched on something that just kind of hit the nerve with me, and that is we keep looking to the polls. Don't you wish we could ask our great-grandchildren, the ones maybe not yet born yet, what do they think about this burden that's being placed on them? I think about Bradford talking about setting stepping stones for future generations. There was a long view, the concept of taking down strongholds and putting generational wealth out there for future generations of children yet unseen. And yet even the Bible tells us that children are a blessing and debt are a curse. And yet the pathology of our society is we are murdering the children and we're taking on the debt. And, there's many families out there right now that are dealing with just serious debt situations. They've been unemployed for 9 months. They're ready to lose their house. And this whole debt discussion can feel like a gigantic weight. And they can feel somewhat defeated because what can they do? They can't get a job, and it's tough. And so hopefully today what, John, you and Marshall and I can do is to talk a little bit about the principles and get that vision back out into the future to that pole that we can't take. What do our great-grandchildren think about being saddled with these debts, and begin to rethink and re-implement biblical principles on economics? Because debt is not just your credit card loan. Debt is taxation on land, or feudal tenure as it's called, which is unconstitutional in most states, and yet we do it anyway. It's government debt. It's commitments by governments such as Social Security and Medicare, which currently are not even funded, and yet our grandchildren are going to hold those. It's fiat money, Marshall, as you put it, money that has no value, and yet the temple was supposed to check the dross in the money to make sure the money had value, and we would not be exchanging fiat currency worth nothing, actually devaluing every day for some good or service that actually was worth something. So hopefully today we can discuss these principles and kind of get them implemented in people's minds, because, 80 years of Keynesian economics has turned us all into a debtor system and a debtor-thinking people.
That's interesting, Dan, because you said the roots. That, to me, that is the key, going back and understanding our roots, because we know our preamble sets forth these basic principles in that document, we the people. I mentioned that earlier, listed to establish our Constitution. And in short, the power comes from the people. And that's a reflection, of course, of the principles of our Declaration, the power the people give to government. So look at it's strictly limited, and I think that's where we need to start. The first sentence of Article 1 implies that all these legislative powers granted shall be vested in Congress, and that the people will grant only limited legislative powers. It's made clear by the enumeration of those powers in Article 1, Section 8. And the point is reiterated again in the 10th Amendment, the final member of the Bill of Rights. but the powers are not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, are given to the states. And so what we're seeing here, that those powers that were enumerated in the Constitution are clear. And to me, that's the thing that we got to go to limit the power of government as shown right there in Article 1, Section 8. For example, the General Welfare Clause. And it doesn't mean that Congress can tax and spend for everything considered general welfare. It cannot be unlimited power. It has to be for a specific purpose, and not to a particular party, for general welfare only, not to this group or that group. It's for the whole nation. And that's why I think we bump up against these. We have all these programs out there, these bogus programs that we're all entitled to, and it just increases our debt. And that's why we're having this discussion on debt.
We have bought into a religious worldview. Let's call it what it is. Call it Christian socialism. Call it Che Guevara and South American communism. But we've bought into this conception that government is going to be the arbiter of what is good and evil, and the arbiter of what people do with their money and who gets it and who doesn't. And so the result is, instead of having just weights and measures, which are called for in the Old Testament and called for throughout the history of money and the history of finance, that where there was a justice in economic relationships, where one man didn't steal from another, and one man's taxes were not necessarily higher than another percentage-wise, but you kept everything in a just basis, because you didn't allow the coins to be shaved, as it says in Isaiah 61. You don't allow inflation. The only way you can not allow inflation is to have the government be what the Constitution says it should be, and that is simply not the creator of rights, not the creator of justice, but the arbiter of making sure things are kept equal before the law. Our Declaration of Independence specifically says that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It doesn't say that the government gives you those rights or that the government is going to arbitrate how happy you are, but it says that you have the right under God to be free from tyranny, and then you have the responsibility in your own life to produce from your own life and your own family. And so this is a protection. The reason for civil government in the Declaration of Independence, it says, is that these rights are to be protected by the government. The government is simply to protect the rights that are already God-given, which shows us that we have a system of economics and a system of government that is built upon a biblical world and life view. When that worldview is destroyed and people say, well, we can't use that view anymore, what you end up with is dog-eat-dog anti-Christian capitalism, and where it's not really capitalism. It's people just eating one another in a system, trying to beat the system, trying to somehow get around government regulation, because the new God, the new laws of society, have become whatever the government says it is that day. And so right now in Washington, the powers that be are fighting over who is going to give benefits to who under a tax structure that is unfair to all. If the entrepreneurs of America knew that it was on a fair and a just field, and that the laws would not change, and the tax code was fair and just to all, they would explode productivity like we haven't seen for 100 years in America. And the reason that they're not doing that, and they're hiding their money in Europe, and they're hiding their money under the mattress, is because the system is no longer just and fair, and they don't know what to expect, because the overlord, the master, the government now, instead of God and his justice, are determining what is fair and what is right.
Well, doesn't that lead us, Marshall, to the golden rule? Love the Lord thy God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Aren't we talking about re-educating the public literally in the sovereign spheres that God has placed for the individual, the sphere of the family, the sphere of the church, and the sphere of the government? I mean, we may as well start at the beginning. The government was never supposed to take over the care of the widows and the orphans. That remained at the church and the individual and the family. And the government was never supposed to actually secure the quality of our money. It was the temple that always was the checking point to make sure that the silver had 3.71 grains of silver in it, or there were no edges cut off. We've got all these spheres messed up because I don't think people have ever really studied and thought about, well, what did God say about the different areas and what are the contained responsibilities? And that's, John, you were talking about that, how the government has stepped way beyond the Constitution, trying to do everything for everybody, and then we become dependent on the government, and then pretty soon the government simply controls us, just like it does with property taxes. Pretty soon, do you really own your land or not? Education was supposed to be in the family's hands.
Well, and that's right. And, you know, the good news is that we have an opportunity to return fiscal sanity to Washington and put, you know, the nation's families, as you said, Marshall, ahead of these political games. And as we stabilize and grow our economy back. But Dan, as you said, I mean, basically, people need to understand what the founders intended in the doctrine of enumerated powers. I really believe that, because that was their belief in our principal defense against this overweening government that we now have. Because, right, if there was no power to do something, the government could hardly abuse that power. And of course, we know there were other defenses as well, dividing power between the national and state governments, leaving most power with the states and the people, and then separating those powers among three branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial, with all of these checks and balances. But, you know, we have to operate within the bounds of these enumerated powers. To me, if we don't start there, we're just going to keep spending because there's no limit.
Well, that's right. And remember, there are 115 prohibitions to power in the Constitution, specifically spoken rules and laws that are protecting the individual and the state from the power of the central government. 115 provisions, and then only 80 expressed granted powers. So there's more prohibitions than there are granted powers. And one of those granted powers is to coin money, for example. The purpose of the government was not to control all things at the local level. As James Madison said in the Federalist Papers 45, that everything goes back down to the states and especially to the local communities and the families in terms of the decisions as to what goes on in that family or community. There should be no involvement of the federal government in that, and they made that very clear. That was the purpose of the Constitution, was to limit the power of an all-powerful state. Remember, all of our founding fathers came out of Europe, and Europe was filled with nothing but an all-powerful state. There had never been anything called free enterprise in Europe. In Europe, the best thing they could come up with was mercantilism, which was the king would then authorize some free enterprise business, like a tea company, to go out and trade, but he would scam off 50% of the profits for himself, and he would tell who's in control of that business, just what Adolf Hitler did to free enterprise in Germany in 1933. Well, this is what Europe has experienced for hundreds of years. And what America turned its back on, and which made it the most productive by 10 times of any nation or any empire in the history of the world, is that America turned back to the biblical premise that is wrong for the government to be God. And so we actually had God be God. Isn't that a unique concept? Where we would follow the eternal principles of right, as George Washington said, and we would voluntarily do the right thing. You see, an economy is built upon people doing the right thing without being forced to, loving their neighbor, caring for their parents, tithing with their money and giving to their local churches and charities. And that is the way life is supposed to be voluntarily. But of course, if we do not do what we should do with our money as we are being productive, then what happens is the state steps in and becomes our God. And freedom is lost, And now you have an unrighteous and a wicked government, which becomes more and more progressively wicked because it gets more and more power, declares itself to be, in essence, God on earth, and it now is going to determine whether or not 55% tax is going to go on your inheritance, so that you can't even give your business over to your kids because they're going to take 55% of it when you die, which is true today, right? So we've got to decide, don't we, as a people? It's bigger than the debt limit. We've got to decide whether we're going to go back to these fundamental principles upon which our nation was founded, or are we going to go down, literally down the economic and the freedom drain and lose all that has been produced over 300 years.
Can't disagree with that one, Marshall. You know, I was thinking of a situation where people have debt and they're concerned about it. You know, God even foresaw that debt would occur. You know, God says debt's not good. You end up being a servant to the lender. But at the same time, sometimes nations would have to raise up an army and defend innocent people from an invading barbarian, and so there would be debt. Or a family faces a huge financial struggle due to a medical illness, which we see today sometimes occurring, or unemployment like we've got right now. But God had set in a system of check and balance called the Jubilee year, where both land and property and debt would be forgiven. And so the entire economic system of lending and borrowing were all controlled within that parameter. Because if you were the lender and there were 20 years left before the Jubilee, and your friend Joe wants to borrow $20, you would have to calculate how the debt would be returned within the 20-year window, because at 20 years it's going to be surrendered anyway. And Joe's character and his ability to have paid in the past and his history would all be part of the program. And I can remember when my uncle wanted to borrow money to build a house up here in Minnesota, my dad had to go into the banker and say, nope, Jim is a good guy, he's got a good job, and he'll pay his debt, and I'll stand for him, because he was new here. And that old system has a lot of merit. It actually reaches back to the Jubilee year system where both the debtor and the lender were contained within God's plan to always provide liberty and freedom to his people. That's what we see in Luke when Jesus steps up and reads the scroll, and it goes all the way back to Isaiah 61 and even goes forward to Romans 8. It's always talking about that liberty, that nobody holds you captive. And I think we've got to realize that God foresaw debt would occur, but debt was constrained. There was always freedom in the future if you met your obligations and did the right things. Again, your children's children could not be held captive by that debt. It eventually would be surrendered or paid, and your character to follow through on closing that debt, paying the bill, etc., was part of the control mechanism for both lender and borrower. God had a perfect system set up, and for about 400 years, the Hebrew Republic operated under that system very, very successfully.
You're right, Dan. The debt ceiling does matter to God. And we'll return in just a few minutes with the story of liberty.